The marble hallways of the U.S. Senate echoed with polished shoes and quiet chatter as former Attorney General Pam Bondi stepped up to the podium. She didn't look angry, she looked confident. Cameras clicked. Lights flared. Then she delivered the line she knew would echo across the world. Lawless countries don't deserve rights. They need to be taught, before they can be trusted. There was a pause. A few murmurs. And then the applause began. Thousands of miles away, in Ouagadougou, the clip flashed across a dusty television in the presidential command room. Ibrahim Traoré watched the words without blinking. He didn't need translation. He understood exactly what she meant. For a moment, the room fell completely silent. Then Traoré stood up slowly, pushed the chair back, and said in a cold, steady voice, "Then she doesn't deserve to speak." He didn't shout. He didn't punch the table. But everyone in the room felt it, a line had just been crossed. Within the hour, Traoré appeared before the press. His statement was short, his tone controlled. When someone claims we are too lawless to deserve our own rights, they reveal the truth, they never intended to respect those rights in the first place. So let it be known, we need no one's permission to exist. And we will not allow anyone to speak over us ever again. The clip exploded across African social media. In Dakar, Nairobi, Bamako and Accra, one phrase was repeated again and again. "You don't deserve to speak." Meanwhile in Washington, Bondi smiled during an interview and said smugly, "He can say whatever he wants. At the end of the day, justice still belongs to us." Traoré heard that comment too. He didn't respond immediately. He simply turned to his Minister of Communication and said, "It's time we show them what justice looks like, when it doesn't belong to them." The next morning, Pam Bondi doubled down. Sitting comfortably in a studio in Washington, she spoke directly into the camera as if delivering a moral lesson to a classroom full of students. If Mr. Traoré thinks he can rewrite global standards of justice, he's deeply mistaken. We created those standards. And we enforce them. Lawless nations don't get to lecture the free world. The host nodded approvingly. The segment went viral across U.S. media, but in Africa, it triggered a very different reaction. In Ouagadougou, Traoré gathered journalists in front of the old Colonial courthouse, an abandoned building that once served foreign judges and ignored local voices. No podium, no teleprompter. Just Traoré standing in front of crumbling stone walls. She says justice belongs to them. But justice applied only to the powerful is not justice, it is control. And today, we say openly, your control ends where our sovereignty begins. The speech wasn't dramatic. It was cold, measured, and it spread like wildfire. Students in Bamako posted videos tearing up photocopies of old colonial constitutions. Artists in Accra projected the quote on government buildings. In small villages across Burkina Faso, elders gathered and said the same phrase in their own languages. You don't deserve to speak. Meanwhile, U.S. officials quietly contacted Pam Bondi, suggesting a softer tone might help ease tensions. She refused. Her next public statement came only hours later. If they don't want our guidance, that's fine. But let's not pretend their version of justice is anything more than chaos dressed in pride. Traoré watched in silence. Then he turned to his security chief and said quietly, "Then we'll show her what pride looks like, when it refuses to kneel." The pressure began quickly. Western media outlets released coordinated op-eds accusing Traoré of subverting international justice and pushing his country into dangerous isolation. Some went even further, calling Burkina Faso a rogue state dressed in revolutionary rhetoric. Bondi appeared again on television, sitting in front of a massive American flag. This is exactly what happens when radicals reject civilized law. They confuse rebellion with righteousness, and drag their people into darkness. In Ouagadougou, the people didn't hide from that message, they confronted it. Teachers brought students into the streets to repaint the old colonial courthouse. The crumbling walls became murals of African freedom leaders, Sankara, Lumumba, Nkrumah, and in the center they wrote, in large block letters, "Justice is not a gift." When Traore arrived to see the mural, he didn't give a formal speech. He simply stood in front of the painted wall and spoke directly into a single camera. Justice is not something we receive from those who once took everything. And it will never again be defined by those who used it to justify their power. The clip reached Washington within minutes. During an emergency press briefing, Bondi slammed the statement as dangerous propaganda. She leaned forward and pointed her finger at the camera. If Traore refuses the standards of civilized nations, then civilized nations need to remind him why those standards exist. Back in Burkina Faso, Traore listened, and didn't flinch. He turned to his inner circle and said, "Then let them remind us. And we will remind them of something else. How empires fall when the people they once silenced finally decide to speak." Bondi didn't wait for diplomacy. Behind the scenes, she pushed for sanctions and asset freezes, encouraging allies to send a clear message to Burkina Faso. Within days, international banking systems began blocking transactions, and foreign contracts were quietly suspended. U.S. media praised the move. "This is how you deal with regimes that threaten global order," said one commentator. Traore heard about the sanctions while visiting a rural school that had been recently rebuilt by villagers. Children sat at wooden desks made by local carpenters. There were no computers, no polished floors, but there was laughter, and there was learning. One of the teachers asked him, "Will this pressure stop our progress?" Traore knelt down beside a desk and looked at the classroom of children. "They can freeze accounts. They can block contracts. But they can't freeze determination. And they can't block the will of a people who already learned to build without them." Later that day, on national television, he addressed the country directly. "Pam Bondi says we are lawless. But the only law she respects is the one that keeps us beneath her. Let her try to strip us of what she never gave us. We do not negotiate our right to exist." Across Burkina Faso, citizens organized community food banks and energy collectives. They called it justice in action. Meanwhile, Bondi went back to the cameras. "If they refuse our standards, we will make sure they feel our absence." Traore's answer came not as a speech, but as a new mural painted across the entire front wall of the rebuilt courthouse. "Your absence is not a threat. It's a beginning." As crowds gathered in front of it, someone in the crowd said quietly, "This time, we speak." The silence didn't last long. Shortly after the mural was revealed, Bondi appeared on the largest U.S. news network, anger replacing the usual smirk. "Let's be very clear, Burkina Faso is walking away from the civilized world. And the civilized world should walk away from them." The phrase echoed like a cold verdict. #civilized world quickly trended in the United States. Traore called no press conference. Instead, he traveled to the southern province of Howard, where farmers had turned abandoned mining storage tunnels into grain reserves. Inside one of the tunnels, illuminated only by oil lamps, he spoke with the farmers and listened to their stories of surviving droughts and embargoes. A young farmer, no older than 20, looked at him and said, "They say we are uncivilized. But it's always the civilized who come to take what is ours." Traore nodded. He stepped outside and addressed the small crowd standing in the moonlight. "They call us lawless. They call us uncivilized. And yet we are the ones feeding one another while they threaten us with hunger." The video of his speech reached millions across Africa within hours. In Accra, people gathered in front of the U.S. Embassy and held up a large banner. "Who defines civilization?" In Washington, Bondi watched the images with disbelief. That same night, she issued her most direct statement yet. "If they refuse our justice, Then we should refuse their voice. Silence them. Back in Ouagadougou, Traore was already preparing the answer. He looked out across the city. The murals, the rebuilt schools, the villagers working side by side, and said quietly, "They want silence? Then we will speak so loudly the world has no choice but to listen." The next morning, U.S. media outlets began quietly removing Traoré's speeches from online platforms. Social media flagged them as misleading geopolitical content. Videos of the murals were marked as potentially extremist. The goal was clear: silence the message, even if they couldn't silence the man. In Ouagadougou, the people noticed. Accounts were suspended. Posts disappeared. But instead of stopping, they adapted. Handwritten flyers appeared on walls and market stalls, quoting Traoré's words. Community radio stations replayed his speeches on repeat. Children began reciting his phrases in school-like lessons. Meanwhile, Bondi stood in front of the Capitol Rotunda and delivered her final demand. "I call on all responsible nations to ignore Ibrahim Traoré's government until they accept real justice. If they refuse our order, we refuse their voice." That afternoon, Traoré walked to the central square, not in presidential uniform, but in simple fatigues. There was no stage, no microphones. Just a crowd waiting. He raised his voice enough for the square to hear. "They want to silence us because we refuse to obey. But they forget something. Voices do not come from permission, they come from people. And as long as our people stand, we will speak. And when they try to erase our words, we will carve them into the walls, into the soil, into memory itself." The crowd didn't cheer. They simply repeated the final line together, over and over, until their voices became a single roar echoing through the streets. "We will speak." The roar from the square became a signal heard far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In Senegal, activists replayed Traoré's words from street loudspeakers. In the Ivory Coast, street artists painted "We will speak" across abandoned colonial buildings. In Kenya and South Africa, students held silent marches carrying only one banner. Speech is not granted, it is taken. Bondi saw the images and, for the first time, hesitated in front of the cameras. She delivered a softer statement, calling for calm and respectful dialogue. But it was too late. The narrative had shifted. The world was no longer asking whether Burkina Faso was lawless. They were asking whether the definition of law had ever been just. Traoré continued his visits, not to embassies or summit halls, but to villages and workshops. In one small town, he entered an old community center where elders were carving new laws on wooden tablets in their local language. One elder looked up and said, "If they erase our words, we write them where only the people can read them." Traoré nodded and replied, "That is justice. Not written in their books, but lived in our lives." That evening, U.S. networks ran a breaking news headline. Pam Bondi calls for reconsideration of sanctions after rising backlash. Someone in Ouagadougou hung a piece of paper next to the headline. On it, 3 simple words. Too late. We spoke. Under growing international scrutiny, the pressure campaign began to quietly crumble. Several Western governments distanced themselves from Bondi's rhetoric. A prominent U.S. newspaper published an editorial titled, "When Justice Turns into Arrogance." In Burkina Faso, the momentum only grew. The rebuilt courthouse became a gathering place where people drafted their own civil charter, written not in legalese, but in clear language every citizen could understand. It began with a single sentence. Rights do not come from above. Traoré arrived unannounced and sat quietly in the back, listening as farmers, teachers, and mothers discussed how their communities should govern themselves. No one deferred to him. They spoke as equals. And when the final draft was read aloud, the president was the first to stand and applaud. That same day, a video surfaced online. It showed Pam Bondi being asked whether she regretted her earlier comments. She shifted uncomfortably and replied, "Well, perhaps the tone could have been different." The clip was shared across Africa with a simple caption. "Now she whispers." Traore saw the clip and said to his advisors, "They called us lawless. They called us unworthy. And today, even their voices no longer carry weight." He paused, then added calmly, "That is the sound of a broken empire." Outside the palace, people gathered again. No banners, no chants, just candles in the night. Children held wooden boards etched with the charter's opening line. And as the wind blew across the square, a single phrase rose like a prayer. "Rights do not come from above." The gathering in the square spread to other towns and villages. In Kedugu, people not only recited the new charter, they began teaching it in classrooms, replacing old textbooks that once quoted foreign legal systems. In Bobo Dioulasso, local musicians turned the words into a song that played on radios and echoed through the markets. Rights are not given. Rights are lived. International media tried one last cycle of alarm. Articles warned that Burkina Faso was abandoning international norms. Bondi appeared on a late-night show and tried to reframe her remarks. "I never said they don't deserve rights. I meant they don't deserve them yet. Rights must be earned." In Ouagadougou, the words reached a group of women rebuilding a small health clinic. One of them removed her dusty gloves, wiped her forehead and calmly said to the reporter nearby, "We already earned our rights the day we refused to lose them." Traore arrived at the clinic an hour later. He walked quietly past the half-painted walls and broken windows now being repaired by volunteers. He paused, placed a hand on the wall, and said to those working around him, "This is not lawlessness. This is justice made by the hands of the people who live it." The next morning, in Washington, Bondi held what would be her final press conference on the issue. But this time, the room was nearly empty. Reporters had turned their attention elsewhere. She began speaking anyway, but halfway through her statement, her voice faltered. For the first time since the conflict began, she realized something. No one was listening. The sun was setting over Ouagadougou as the final words of the charter were carved into the stone wall of the old courthouse. No speeches had been planned, yet people filled the square, young and old, farmers, doctors, musicians, teachers, standing shoulder to shoulder in quiet pride. Traore walked toward the wall, past hundreds of faces glimmering in the evening light. When he reached the front, he placed his hand on the carved stone and spoke, not to the crowd, but to the history that had led them here. "For too long, our voice was treated as noise. They called us lawless, uncivilized, unworthy of deciding our own future. But today, we have spoken louder than their judgments. And our words have become law." He stepped back. The crowd didn't applaud. Instead, they began reciting the charter aloud line by line, their voices steady, unbroken. It was not a chant. It was a declaration. Somewhere in Washington, Pam Bondi sat in silence, watching a muted replay of the scene. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but closed it again. There was nothing left to say. For the first time, the accusation of lawlessness no longer felt like power. It felt like irrelevance. And in Burkina Faso, Traore raised his eyes to the crowd and spoke the final words of the night. "We never needed permission to speak. We only needed the courage to speak. And refused to stop." The square echoed with a single phrase. "Rights do not come from permission. They come from us." And with that, a nation once called lawless became the author of its own law. They told us justice belonged to them. They claimed we were too lawless, too uncivilized, too unworthy to define it for ourselves. And for a long time, they spoke, while we were expected to stay silent. But silence is not law. And obedience is not justice. Today we raise our voices without fear. We build without permission. And we define justice not by their approval, but by our dignity. So to anyone who still believes we need their permission to speak, we have already spoken. And we are never going silent again.